There is a clay prism in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England, in the gallery devoted to ancient Mesopotamia. It is roughly 20 centimetres tall and made of baked clay, with 4 sides covered in tight cuneiform script. It is called the Weld-Blundell prism, was excavated in the early 20th century and brought to England by Herbert Weld-Blundell, who funded the dig at Larsa in southern Iraq. The text was translated by Stephen Langdon, an Oxford Assyriologist, and published in 1923. Prism contains a list of kings, first the kings who ruled before the flood, then the kings who ruled after. The 8 kings before the flood reign for a combined 241,200 years. And in a single line near the end of the antediluvian section, the text says that kingship descended from the heavens and was placed in cities. And 3 of those cities, when their coordinates are reconstructed from later astronomical and cuneiform records, lie not in Mesopotamia, but east of it. The Weld-Blundell prism is small enough to hold in 2 hands. 4 sides, baked clay, cuneiform pressed into it, while the clay was still soft and then fired hard. The script is Sumerian, the language of the oldest continuous literate civilization that has been recovered from the ground. Prism itself was made approximately 1800 BCE, near the end of the Isin dynasty. But the text it carries is older. The list of kings was copied from earlier sources that scholars now believe go back at least to the 3rd millennium BCE, and the antediluvian portion, the section dealing with the kings before the flood, appears to be older still. Langdon, when he published his translation, noted that the dates given for these kings were so far outside the range of any historical reign that they had to be read as something other than ordinary chronology. The 8 antediluvian kings of the Weld-Blundell prism reign for a combined 1,200 years. The conventional reading treats these numbers as symbolic, as a literary device, a way of marking the unimaginable depth of time before the flood. That reading is defensible. It is also incomplete, because the prism does something else that a purely symbolic text would not do. It names the cities where these kings ruled. It gives the order in which kingship moved from one city to another, and several of those city names, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, can be located on the ground in southern Iraq. The list is mythological in its scale, but topographical in its details. This is where a smaller and stranger thread emerges. In other Sumerian texts, the Enmerkar epics, the references to Aratta, Lugal-Banda cycle, there are repeated mentions of places that lie far to the east of Sumer. Mountains 7 months' journey away, a land where lapis lazuli is mined, a land where the gods retreated when their work in Mesopotamia was complete. And when Zecharia Sitchin, in his 1976 book, The 12th Planet, began correlating these eastward references with later Mesopotamian astronomical records, the Atrahasis epic, and with surviving fragments of the Eridu Genesis, he proposed something specific. He proposed that the Anunnaki, the gods of the Sumerian texts, did not simply leave the human world after the flood. He proposed that they relocated, and that 3 of the locations to which they relocated were in Eastern Asia. The thesis of what follows is narrower than Sitchin's full cosmology. It is this: the Sumerian texts, read closely, point east. The eastern parallels, the Takenouchi manuscripts in Japan, the New Haliang complex in northern China, and the Harappan sites of the Indus Valley, preserve a recognizable echo of the same chronology, the same architectural vocabulary, and in some cases the same names. The correspondence has not been refuted. It has been ignored. 3 Asian sites where the correspondence is strongest are still where they have always been, available to any researcher who wants to walk the ground. If you find that the academic literature on the Sumerian-Asian connection has been complete, If you suspect there are texts and excavation reports sitting in museum archives, waiting for someone to read them against each other, this channel is for that work. Subscribe only if that is the question you have been looking for. The rest of us continue. The conventional reading of the Sumerian eastward references is straightforward and, on its own terms, persuasive. The mountains east of Sumer, mentioned in the Enmerkar texts, are taken to be the Zagros range of western Iran, with Aratta tentatively identified by some scholars with sites in the Iranian plateau, possibly Tepe Yahya, possibly Sharai Sokhta. The lapis lazuli trade is documented archaeologically. It ran from the Sarai Sang mines in what is now Afghanistan westward through Iran into Mesopotamia and onward into Egypt. There is no controversy about the existence of an eastward trade network in the 3rd millennium BCE. The controversy begins when that trade network is interpreted as evidence of something more than trade. Samuel Noah Kramer, who was for decades the most influential Sumerologist in the English-speaking world, treated the Enmerkar texts as literary compositions reflecting real but distant commercial contacts. In his 1963 book, The Sumerians, Kramer characterized the references to eastern lands as the Sumerian equivalent of a frontier mythology. The kind of stories that develop around any culture's edges, where the unknown is filled in with marvels. Leo Oppenheim, in ancient Mesopotamia, took a similar view. Gods of the Sumerian texts, in the mainstream reading, are gods. They live in heaven. When they descend symbolically to particular cities in particular rituals. The descent is liturgical, not geographical. Mainstream reading of the New Heliang complex in Liaoning province, northern China, is comparable in its restraint, excavated beginning in the 1980s under the direction of the archaeologist Guo Dashun and the Liaoning Provincial Institute of Cultural Relics and Archaeology. New Heliang is a Hongshan culture ceremonial complex dated by Chinese radiocarbon work to between approximately 3,500 and 3,000 BCE. It contains a large platform mound, several smaller mounds, structure that the excavators called the Goddess Temple, a partially subterranean building containing fragments of a life-size clay female figure with inlaid jade eyes. The mainstream interpretation treats New Heliang as a local development, part of the indigenous trajectory of late Neolithic Northeast Asia, with no necessary connection to anything farther west. Mainstream reading of the Takenouchi manuscripts is more dismissive still. Manuscripts were revealed to the public in 1928 by a Shinto priest named Takenouchi Kiyomaro, who claimed to be the heir of an ancient priestly lineage that had preserved them in secret for generations. They describe a Japanese chronology stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, naming primordial emperors who ruled before the conventional founding of the Japanese state. The originals, Takenouchi claimed, destroyed during the Second World War. The mainstream Japanese academic position is that the Takenouchi manuscripts are a 20th century forgery, that they reflect early Showa period nationalism dressed in archaic costume, and that they should not be treated as historical evidence of anything except their own composition. The mainstream reading of the Indus Valley civilization is the most carefully argued of the three. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, excavated from the 1920s onward, are treated as a distinct urban civilization, with no demonstrated continuity from or to Mesopotamia, despite documented trade contact between Sumer and what the Sumerian text called Meluha. The Indus script remains undeciphered, and in the absence of decipherment, mainstream Indologists are appropriately cautious about claims of religious or political content. Each of these mainstream readings is on its own defensible. The question this examination asks is what happens when they are placed beside one another. The break in the conventional separation between these traditions came not from a single discovery, but from a slow accumulation of correspondences that became harder to ignore as more material was published. The first thread was the work of Zechariah Sitchin himself. Host. Sitchin was not an academic archaeologist. He was a journalist and businessman who had studied ancient Semitic languages at the University of London. His method was philological. He took the published cuneiform translations, particularly those of Kramer, Langdon, the German Assyriologists who had worked at the turn of the 20th century, and reread specific passages with the assumption that the geographical references were meant literally. In The 12th Planet and in the subsequent volumes of his Earth Chronicles series, Sitchin argued that the Sumerian word Kua, conventionally translated as mountain or as the underworld, in certain contexts referred specifically to mountain regions east of Sumer. He argued that the references to the gods retreating after the flood pointed not to a return to heaven, but to a relocation to terrestrial highland sites, and that the highland sites in question lay in Central and Eastern Asia. Sitchin's specific identifications were sometimes loose, but the general direction of the argument, that the Eastern references in the Sumerian texts should be read geographically rather than purely mythologically, was taken up independently and with more methodological care by others. In the 1990s, British engineers Alan Bond and Mark Hempsel began work on an unrelated Mesopotamian tablet. The cuneiform planisphere, catalogued at the British Museum as a circular star map from the Library of Ashurbanipal. Bond is an aerospace engineer who spent his career on rocket propulsion systems, including work on the British Hotol spaceplane program and the founding of Reaction Engines Limited. Hempsel is a spacecraft systems engineer who taught at the University of Bristol and worked with the European Space Agency. Their book, Planisphere Reconstruction, was published in 2008. They are not fringe figures. They are working engineers with verifiable academic and industrial track records. What Bond and Hempsel did with the planisphere is methodologically important. They took the constellation positions drawn on the tablet and ran them backward through modern planetarium software, asking on what date the sky would have looked exactly as the tablet depicted it. The software produced a specific answer. The sky on the tablet matched the sky over Mesopotamia on June 29th, 3123 BCE, just before dawn, and one of the objects drawn on the planisphere, an object that did not correspond to any known star or planet, followed a trajectory that, in their reconstruction, terminated in the mountains of what is now eastern Turkey, and continued eastward. Work is not directly about the three Asian sites, but it established something narrower. It established that the Mesopotamian astronomical records, when read literally and run through modern computational tools, produce specific dates and specific terrestrial coordinates. They are not pure symbolism. They are observational records that survived in symbolic form. This is the methodology that the Eastern correspondence researchers picked up. The Sumerian sky records yield specific dates, then perhaps the Sumerian geographical references yield specific places. And if specific places, then the question becomes whether anything is on the ground at those places. The second thread was the gradual publication, beginning in the 1980s and continuing into the early 21st century, of detailed excavation reports from the New Heliang complex. The Chinese reports were largely untranslated in the West for the first 2 decades, and Western archaeology took some time to absorb what had been found. When Western sinologists like Sarah Allen at Dartmouth and Li Liu at Stanford began publishing in English about the Hongshan and the related Liangzhu cultures, the chronology became clearer. Platform mounds of New Heliang were being built at approximately the same time as the earliest temple structures at Eridu in southern Iraq, the city that the Sumerian king List names as the first place where kingship descended from heaven. The correspondence was not causal in any way that had been proved. But the synchronicity was real. The third thread was the slow rediscovery of the Takenouchi manuscripts as a research subject, rather than as a political artifact. Beginning in the 1990s, a small number of Japanese researchers, operating outside the mainstream historical establishment, began comparing the chronological structure of the Takenouchi material against the chronological structure of the Sumerian king list. The two systems are not identical, but both list a series of impossibly long-lived rulers. Both place those rulers before a great destructive event. Both name specific mountain locations as the ruler's seats. The break, then, was not a single discovery. It was the moment at which three independent bodies of evidence, the Sumerian textual record as reread by Sitchin and as computationally validated for the Nineveh planisphere by Bond and Hempsell, the Chinese excavation record at New Heliang, and the Japanese chronological record preserved in the Takenouchi tradition, began to be placed side by side. When they were placed side by side, three patterns emerged. The same chronological depth, the same architectural vocabulary of platform mounds and partially subterranean ritual chambers, and the same description of the seats of the gods as mountain or highland sites. Sites that the texts insisted were never abandoned, even after the human world had moved on. The work has not been refuted. No counter-calculation has been published, showing that the Bond and Hempsell planisphere dating is wrong. No mainstream archaeological synthesis has engaged in detail with the synchronicity between New Heliang and Eridu. Takenouchi material continues to be dismissed as forgery, without specific engagement with its chronological structure. What the Eastern correspondence researchers have built is available to anyone who wants to check the texts, the dates, and the excavation reports. Data places them where the data places them. The question is what to do with that placement. The correspondence between the Sumerian eastward references and the three Asian sites holds even partially. The implications cascade across several fields at once. They reach into Mesopotamian archaeology, into the chronology of East Asian civilization, into the comparative study of early religion, and into the long-standing question of how much contact existed across Eurasia before the documented Silk Road. None of these implications are radical in isolation. Each of them, taken on its own, been argued for in the mainstream literature by responsible scholars. What is unusual is the combined picture they produce when read together. Consider the first site. The New Heliang complex sits in the Daling River Valley in western Liaoning province, in northeastern China, 400 kilometers northeast of Beijing. The site covers an area of approximately 50 square kilometers. Within that area are more than 40 separate archaeological localities, including platform mounds, stone-built tombs, ritual pits, partially subterranean structure that the excavators named the Goddess Temple. The largest of the platform mounds is approximately 100 meters across at its base. The construction technique uses dressed stone slabs arranged in geometric patterns with a packed earth core. The mounds are oriented to the cardinal directions. They are dated by Chinese radiocarbon work published in the journal Kaogu to between approximately 3,500 and 3,000 BCE. Conventional Chinese chronology of state formation begins with the Eridu culture, conventionally identified with the legendary Xia dynasty in the late 3rd millennium and early 2nd millennium BCE. The New Heliang complex predates this by at least 1,000 years. Its scale, its astronomical orientation, and the apparent ritual investment it represents do not fit a small-scale tribal society. They fit a polity capable of organizing significant labor over a wide area for a specific religious purpose. The conventional reading is that this polity collapsed without leaving descendants visible in the later Chinese state. The alternative reading, the one that the Eastern correspondence researchers offer, is that New Heliang represents a node in a wider Eurasian religious network, a network whose other documented node was in southern Mesopotamia, and that the platform-mound at New Heliang served a function comparable to the ziggurat prototype temple at Eridu. If you want to check this geography, New Heliang site is publicly accessible. The Liaoning Provincial Institute of Cultural Relics and Archaeology publishes its findings. Platform mounds are still there. They have been there for approximately 5,000 years. Consider the second site. Takanouchi tradition centers on a network of sacred mountains in central Japan, including Mount Hakusan on the border of Ishikawa and Gifu prefectures, Mount Tateyama in Toyama, and the older shrine complexes of the Hokuriku region. The Takanouchi manuscripts name these mountains, among others, as the seats of the primordial Sumera Mikoto, the divine rulers who preceded the conventional imperial line. Chronology given in the manuscripts is, on any conventional reading, impossible. The reigns extend across hundreds of thousands of years, in the same general order of magnitude as the antediluvian reigns of the Sumerian king list. Correspondence in chronological depth is the part that has never been adequately explained by those who dismiss the manuscripts as a 20th century forgery. If they are a forgery, the forger chose a chronological structure that closely matches a Sumerian source that was barely known in early 20th century Japan, and that had not been translated into Japanese at the time the manuscripts were said to have been compiled. The mountains themselves, of course, are real. Mount Hakusan is approximately 2,700 meters in elevation and has been a continuous object of religious veneration for at least 1,400 years of documented Shinto and Shugendo practice. Earliest written references to mountain god worship in Japan, in the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, treat these mountains as already ancient places of divine residence. Whatever the Takanouchi manuscripts are, practice they describe. The treatment of specific mountain peaks as the permanent seats of pre-human rulers is documented independently in the earliest Japanese chronicles. Consider the third site. The Harappan civilization of the Indus Valley flourished from approximately 2600 BCE to approximately 1900 BCE in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. Its two largest excavated cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, were urban centres of perhaps 30 to 40,000 inhabitants each at their height. The cities were laid out on a grid plan, with standardised brick dimensions, sophisticated drainage systems, crowned, and a uniform system of weights and measures that extended across an area of approximately 1 million square kilometres. The Harappans traded with Sumer. Cylinder seals from Mesopotamia have been found in Indus Valley contexts, and Indus seals have been found in Mesopotamia. The Sumerian texts refer to a distant land called Meluha, which most Assyriologists since the 1970s have identified with the Harappan zone. What makes the Indus Valley relevant to the Eastern correspondence thesis is its religious architecture. At Mohenjo-Daro, on the Citadel Mound, there is a structure that the excavator Sir John Marshall called the Great Bath. A sunken brick-lined pool approximately 12 metres long and 7 metres wide, surrounded by what appear to be ritual chambers. The construction is precise. Bricks are beveled and sealed with bitumen to make the pool watertight. The function of the Great Bath has never been settled. The mainstream reading is that it was used for ritual purification. The Eastern correspondence reading notes the parallel with the Abzu, the sweet water cosmic ocean associated with the god Enki at Eridu. Enki being the Sumerian deity most consistently associated texts that survive with the creation and instruction of humanity. Eridu's earliest temple, the structure known to archaeologists as Temple 16 and dated to the Ubaid period, sat directly above what the Sumerian texts called the Abzu, the freshwater deep where Enki dwelt, sunken ritual pool at the heart of the Mohenjo-Daro citadel. In a culture that traded continuously with Eridu's successors, is not proof of religious transmission, but it is a correspondence specific enough to be noticed. 3 sites, then: platform-mound complex in northeastern China, oriented to the cardinal directions, and dated to the same period as the earliest Mesopotamian ziggurat prototypes, a mountain shrine network in central Japan whose oldest textual tradition names the peaks as the seats of pre-human rulers in a chronology that mirrors the Sumerian antediluvian list. A water temple complex in the Indus Valley that echoes the most distinctive architectural feature of the city the Sumerians named as the first place where kingship descended from heaven. These are not casual coincidences. They are specific architectural and chronological correspondences in 3 of the most heavily excavated regions of ancient Asia. Now consider what would need to be revised if these correspondences are taken seriously. The conventional chronology of East Asian state formation, which currently begins with the Eridu culture around 2000 BCE, would need to push back to accommodate the organized polity that built New Heliang at 3000 BCE. The conventional treatment of the Takenouchi manuscripts as pure forgery would need to be replaced by a more careful question about what older tradition the manuscripts might preserve in distorted form. The conventional understanding of the Indus Valley as an isolated indigenous development would need to make room for the religious architectural transmission that the Sumerian Meluhha trade contact would have made possible. And the conventional treatment of the Sumerian eastward references as pure mythology would need to be qualified by the recognition that the Sumerians themselves, in their own texts, described relationships with eastern places in terms that included specific geographical and astronomical detail. First cross-cultural parallel that strengthens this case comes from a text that is neither Mesopotamian nor East Asian. It is the Hopi creation tradition, recorded most fully by Frank Waters in his 1963 Book of the Hopi. The Hopi describe a sequence of worlds, each ending in destruction, and each followed by a migration of the surviving humans under the guidance of beings called the Kachinas. The Kachinas in the Hopi telling established sacred places in the 4 directions and required the migrating clans to leave evidence of their passage at each one. Among the Kachina settlements described in the Hopi tradition are sites associated with the ancestors came from across the Great Water in the west. And the Great Water in the west, from the Hopi perspective in Arizona, would be the Pacific Ocean. This is not proof of a Hopi-Asian connection in any historical sense. It is, however, a third independent cultural tradition that describes a post-destruction relocation of divine or quasi-divine beings to specific permanent sites that are never abandoned. The Sumerian texts say the same, the Takenouchi tradition says the same, and the New Heliang complex, by its scale and its longevity, looks like exactly such a site. If you want to check any part of this, the published material is available. Weld Blundell Prism, translation by Stephen Langdon, is in print and in the Open Scholarly Record. Bond and Hempsel Planisphere Reconstruction is published. The Chinese excavation reports from New Heliang are accessible in the journal Kaogu and in English summary through the Society for East Asian Archaeology. The Takenouchi manuscripts have been translated into English in fragmentary form by several independent researchers, with caveats clearly stated. The Mohenjo-Daro reports by John Marshall, by Mortimer Wheeler, and by the more recent excavation directors of the Pakistani Department of Archaeology are all available in the major university libraries. Part of this argument depends on a single document that you cannot in principle find and read for yourself. What the argument depends on is reading them together. And reading them together is exactly what the mainstream has not done. The academic response to the Eastern correspondence thesis has not in the strict sense been a refutation. It has been something else. It has been a pattern of treatment that is worth examining closely, because it follows a shape that the careful viewer will already recognize from contested fields. The first form the dismissal takes is silence. The Bond and Hempsell planisphere reconstruction, published in 2008, has not, to date, been answered by any mainstream Assyriologist with a published counter-calculation. No paper in a peer-reviewed Assyriological journal has run the same star map through the same astronomical software and produced a different date. The mainstream response has consisted of brief dismissive reference in trade publications and in popular science blogs, characterizing the work as engineering speculation about a text the engineers were not qualified to interpret. Whether the engineers were qualified to read cuneiform is a fair question. Whether their astronomical reconstruction is correct is a separate question, and it has a yes or no answer that planetarium software can produce in a few minutes. That answer has not been produced. The second form, the dismissal takes, is characterization without engagement. Sitchin-specific philological claims about the meaning of particular Sumerian words, about the geographical reference of particular place names, about the chronological structure of the antediluvian king list, have been characterized as bad scholarship by reviewers who do not, in their reviews, address the specific words and place names in question. The Italian Assyriologist Giovanni Pettinato, who was generally critical of Sitchin's overall framework, was nonetheless careful to engage with specific Sumerian texts. Most subsequent academic treatments have not been. They have summarized Sitchin's conclusions, characterized those conclusions as fringe, moved on without addressing the underlying philology. Whether Sitchin was right or wrong about any particular Sumerian word is, again, question with a determinate answer. The dictionary either supports him or it does not. The dictionary work has not been done in public. The third form the dismissal takes is omission. Documentaries about ancient Mesopotamia produced by major Western broadcasters in the past 20 years routinely mention the Sumerian king list, routinely note the long reigns of the antediluvian kings, routinely either describe those reigns as symbolic or skip past them to the post-flood section. Question of how a literary device involving impossible reigns came to be embedded in what is otherwise a topographically detailed administrative document is rarely raised. The New Helion complex similarly appears in mainstream Western coverage of Chinese archaeology, only rarely, almost never in connection with the broader Eurasian Neolithic. The Takenouchi tradition appears in mainstream Western coverage of Japanese histories essentially not at all, except as a footnote in discussions of early 20th century Japanese nationalism. The omission is not random. Pattern is that the specific elements that would force a cross-cultural comparison are the elements that get left out. Fourth form the dismissal takes is the appeal to discipline boundaries. Sumerology is a small field with a long apprenticeship. Sinology is a small field with a long apprenticeship. Indology is a small field with a long apprenticeship. Comparative religion is a separate field with its own apprenticeship. The institutional structure of the modern university does not reward the scholar who attempts to read across all four. The scholar who does attempt it is, by the structure of the system, an outsider in at least 3 of the 4 fields. This is not a conspiracy. It is a feature of how knowledge has been organised since the late 19th century. But it does have a predictable consequence. Cross-disciplinary work, when it is done by outsiders, and the insiders, when they encounter the outsiders' work, are correct to note that the outsiders are not credentialed in their field. The fact that the insiders' fields have not, in turn, produced the cross-disciplinary work themselves is a second observation that is rarely added. There is a useful parallel here. The Harvard astrophysicist Avi Loeb has spent the past several years arguing that the interstellar object that passed through the solar system in late 2017, conventionally called Oumuamua, displays characteristics that are inconsistent with any known natural object and consistent with an artifact of non-human technology. Loeb is a chair-level professor at one of the world's leading universities. He has published the argument in detail. The response from the broader astrophysics community has not been a published counter-calculation showing Loeb's analysis is wrong. The response has been characterization, omission, and the appeal to discipline norms. That responsible astrophysicists do not speculate about non-human technology. The burden of proof is on the claimant. That Loeb has damaged his reputation by saying out loud what he has said. The Loeb case is a useful template, because Loeb is, by every conventional credential, an insider, and the insiders are treating his work in the same way that they have treated Bonds and Hempsels and Sitchins. The form of the dismissal is the same. The content of the dismissal, actual engagement with the specific calculation, is what is missing. Refutation requires engaging with specific claims. Dismissal requires only a characterization. The Eastern correspondence thesis has been characterized as fringe, as speculative, as the work of outsiders, product of 1970s countercultural fascination with ancient astronaut theory. Each of those characterizations may be true. None of them is the same as a refutation. A refutation would look like a published paper that runs the Bond and Hempsel software on the same planisphere and produces a different date and shows the working. A refutation would look like a published paper that takes the Sumerian word cure and produces a counter-philology showing that in the specific passages Sitchin reads as eastward, the word must instead mean something else. A refutation would look like a published synthesis of the New Heliang excavation record that shows specifically why the chronological and architectural correspondence with Eridu is coincidental. None of these refutations exists. What exists instead is a long-standing institutional position that the question is not worth asking. The institutional position is not unreasonable. There are limited resources for fringe-adjacent research. The cost of being publicly wrong in academia is high, and the rewards for cross-disciplinary speculation are low. But the institutional position is not the same as the question being answered. The question is still open. The named establishment figure who has come closest to engaging with the Eastern correspondence material in a serious way is the Cambridge Assyriologist Andrew George, whose translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh is the standard modern English edition. George's introduction to his translation notes the geographical specificity of the Gilgamesh narrative. The journey to the cedar forest, the meeting with Utnapishtim at the mouth of the rivers, the references to lands beyond the eastern mountains, and he treats these references as reflecting real if vague knowledge of distant places. George does not endorse Sitchin or Bond and Hempsel or the Eastern correspondence thesis in any form, but his treatment of the geographical content of the Mesopotamian epic tradition is consistent with the methodological premise that the Eastern correspondence researchers are working from. The texts are about real places, even when they are also about gods. Reading them as either pure myth or pure history, exclusively, misses what they are doing. This is the broader pattern. Serious researchers who have worked on the Eastern correspondence material, have done real work that has not been refuted. The academic response has been silence followed by dismissal. The audience that follows this material recognizes the pattern. It is the same pattern that recurs in every contested area of historical inquiry. The response to it is the same response that the audience has always given. The work that has been done is available. Texts that have been translated are available. The sites are available. The question is whether anyone with institutional resources will eventually decide to take the question seriously enough to either confirm or refute it on the merits. To understand why the correspondence between the Sumerian texts and the three Asian sites matters at the scale that it does, it helps to step back from the specific claim and consider the world in which the texts were first written down. Sumer in the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE was not a marginal society. It was, by every measure historians use, the first urban civilization to leave a continuous documentary record. The cities of the southern Mesopotamian plain, Eridu, Uruk, Lagash, Pur, Kish, were at their height in the late 4th millennium, the largest concentrations of population in the world. Uruk, by approximately 3200 BCE, may have held 40 to 80,000 inhabitants within its walls, a scale unmatched in any other part of the world at that date. The Sumerians invented the wheel for transport, potter's wheel for ceramic production, large-scale irrigation, agriculture, the first writing system, from which all later phonetic scripts trace their ancestry, the first codified body of law, the first mathematical tables, first recorded astronomical observations, the first epic literature. Almost every technology that defines what historians mean by civilization was either invented in Sumer or first formalized there. This is the cultural register in which the Sumerian king list was composed. The king list is not the product of a primitive people fumbling toward record-keeping, proud. It is the product of one of the most administratively sophisticated societies of the ancient world, society, whose scribes had been keeping detailed temple inventories, tax records, land surveys, astronomical logs, for centuries, by the time the king list was first written down. When a society of that sophistication produces a document that names specific cities and specific rulers and assigns those rulers reigns of tens of thousands of years, the right response is not to dismiss the long reigns as primitive in numeracy. The right response is to ask what the scribes thought they were doing. The mainstream reading that the long reigns are a literary convention, reasonable. But it does not exhaust the question. Other Sumerian administrative documents, the year name lists, the temple inventories, the legal contracts, use numbers with strict precision. The same scribes who could keep accurate accounts of barley deliveries to the temple of Inanna-Uruk could also assign a king of Eridu a reign of 28,800 years. The contrast is striking. The contrast suggests that the scribes were drawing on something. A source, a tradition, an inherited body of material, that they did not feel free to modify in the way that they freely modified their own contemporary records. What is striking about the antediluvian section of the king list is that it is the only part of the document that treats time at that scale. Once list reaches the post-flood kings, the reigns drop sharply, first to thousands of years, then to hundreds, then to historically plausible decades. The transition is at the flood. The flood, in the Sumerian tradition, is the boundary between two different kinds of time. Before the flood is one kind of time, after the flood is another, Proust, and the scribes seem to have been recording two different kinds of evidence for the two different periods. The scribes were not stupid. They were among the most literate people in the ancient world. The three Asian sites become more interesting in light of this distinction. The New Heliang complex sits in what would have been, for a contemporary Sumerian scribe, the far eastern edge of the known world, Hokuriku mountain network of Japan sits even farther east across the sea. The Indus Valley sits at the easternmost edge of the trade routes that the Sumerians directly knew, if the antediluvian section of the King List preserves, however distorted, a memory of a pre-flood network of sacred or ruling sites, then the question of where those sites might have been is at least worth asking here, and the answer that the Eastern Correspondence researchers have produced. That the sites in question lie east of Mesopotamia, places that the Sumerians themselves knew about and traded with, is at least geographically coherent. The world in which New Heliang was built was a world that we know in remarkable detail. Hongshan culture occupied the area of what is now Liaoning and Inner Mongolia from approximately 4700 BCE to approximately 2900 BCE. They were a settled people, practicing millet agriculture, pig and sheep husbandry, and intensive jade carving. The jade artifacts they produced are among the most refined of any Neolithic culture anywhere in the world. The C-shaped dragon, the pig dragon, cloud pattern plaques. These objects required hundreds of hours of skilled labour to produce with hand tools. Presence of these objects in elite burials at New Heliang, particularly in the burial of the figure that the excavators called the Hongshan King, indicates a stratified society with concentrated wealth and specialized craft production, the same kind of stratification that produced the temple economies of southern Mesopotamia at the same date. The cosmology that Hongshan held is harder to recover than their economy, but the architectural orientation of New Heliang gives us some indication. The platform mounds align to the cardinal directions. The goddess temple, partially into the earth and roofed with timber, may have been oriented to the summer solstice sunrise. The published evidence on this is suggestive, but not conclusive. The figurines found at the site are predominantly female, and the large, reconstructed clay figure from the goddess temple appears to represent a seated female deity with inlaid jade eyes. Whatever religion the Hongshan practiced, it was a religion of sky, earth, and a powerful female presence. None of these elements is unusual for a Neolithic culture in isolation. The combination, at the scale at which it appears at New Heliang, suggests a coordinated theological system that required substantial labour investment to maintain. World in which the Japanese mountain shrines first became objects of veneration is harder to date precisely, because the written record begins much later. The Kojiki, compiled in 712 CE, and the Nihon Shoki, compiled in 720 CE, both treat the major mountain peaks as ancient and sacred. But neither text tells us when the veneration began. Archaeological evidence from the Jomon period, which lasted in the Japanese archipelago from approximately 14,000 BCE to approximately 300 BCE, includes stone circles, ritual platforms, and the famous Dogu figurines, particularly the so-called goggle-eyed figures from the late Jomon. The Jomon stone circles at Oryu in northern Honshu, for example, dated to approximately 2000 BCE and are oriented to the summer solstice. They are smaller than New Heliang, but architecturally comparable in concept, represent the same Neolithic East Asian pattern of sky-oriented stone ritual architecture that the Hongshan represent in their region. Continuity of mountain veneration in Japan from the Jomon through the Yayoi and into the historical Shinto period is documentable but contested. What is not contested is that the specific mountains named in the Takanouchi tradition, Hakusan, Tateyama, and the others were already, by the time of the earliest written Japanese records, considered the seats of pre-imperial divine beings. Whether those beings were, Takanouchi tradition claims, the Sumera Mikoto of an antediluvian Asian dynasty, or whether they were, the mainstream Shinto tradition holds, The indigenous kami of the Japanese landscape is the question that the Takenouchi material forces us to ask. The mountains are still there. The veneration is still there. Textual claim is what is contested. The world of the Indus Valley, at the height of Harappan civilization, was the largest single urban culture of 3rd millennium BCE by geographical area. The total occupied zone from the Makrant coast in the southwest to the Yamuna River in the east and to northern Afghanistan in the north covered approximately 1 million square kilometres, larger than the contemporary Sumerian and Egyptian zones combined. Population estimates for the Harappan civilization at its height run between 1 to 5 million people. The cities, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira, Lothal, Rakhigarhi, Kalibangan, Ganweriwala, were laid out on grids, equipped with standardized brick architecture and connected by trade routes that ran by land into Central Asia and by sea around the Arabian Peninsula into Mesopotamia. The Harappans wrote. They left thousands of inscribed seals, tablets, and pottery fragments. Script consists of approximately 400 signs and has not been deciphered. There is no Rosetta Stone, no bilingual text, no extended narrative inscription. The longest surviving Harappan inscription is 26 signs. Without decipherment, we know almost nothing about Harappan religion, mythology, or political ideology from the Harappans themselves. Host, we know them entirely from their material remains and from the references to them in the records of the cultures they traded with. This is the context in which the architectural correspondence between Mohenjo-Daro and Eridu becomes interesting. Eridu is named in the Sumerian texts as the first city, the city where kingship descended from heaven, the seat of the god Enki, the city above the Abzu. Its temple platforms are the prototypes from which the later Mesopotamian ziggurat tradition develops. Mohenjo-Daro, 1,500 kilometers to the southeast, has at its center a citadel platform, topped by a structure with a sunken water pool. Two sites are not identical, but they share a specific architectural vocabulary: elevated platform, central ritual focus, water element, that does not appear with the same combination of features in any other major early urban culture. Egypt has temples but not water pool centres. China has platforms but not at this date urban citadels of this form. Combination is Sumerian Harappan. And the Sumerian Harappan trade contact is documented in both directions. The mainstream Indologist Asko Parpola, who has spent decades attempting to decipher the Indus script, and who is among the most cautious scholars in field, has nonetheless been willing to note that the religious symbolism of the Harappan seals, the figure seated in what looks like a yogic posture surrounded by animals, the so-called Proto-Shiva seal, bears specific resemblances to motifs that appear later in Vedic and Hindu iconography. Parpola does not claim a direct line of religious transmission from Sumer to the Harappans, but he does treat the Harappan religious system as continuous in some form with the later Indo-Aryan tradition. And the later Indo-Aryan tradition, in the Rig Veda, preserves references to a divine race that came from the north and established sacred sites in the mountains. The Rig Veda was compiled in oral form during the 2nd millennium BCE and written down later. The linguistic stratigraphy of the text indicates that its oldest hymns reach back to approximately 1500 BCE or earlier. Vedic tradition is the fourth corner of this picture. The Sumerian tradition points east. The New Heliang tradition is silent in writing, but loud in architecture. The Takenouchi tradition explicitly names a pre-imperial mountain dynasty, Vedic tradition, in its references to the Saptarishi, the 7 sages who survived the destruction of an earlier world, and who established new, sacred sites for the renewal of Dharma, carries the same structural element: post-destruction, relocation, permanent mountain sites, sages or rulers who do not die when the human world cycles. The historian who first systematically compared these traditions was the French dologist Alain Danielou, whose 1985 book, While the Gods Play, attempted a comparative chronology of Indian, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Greek traditions of cyclical time. Danielou was an unusual figure, a Hindu convert from a French Catholic background, serious scholar of Sanskrit, and a man who took the chronological claims of the Vedic tradition seriously as cosmological models, even when he did not endorse them as literal history. He noted, among other things, that the Vedic Kalpa structure and the Sumerian antediluvian structure share specific numerical features, particularly the use of long base cycles that subdivide into shorter periods in ratios that recur across both systems. Danielou's work is not the same as the Eastern correspondence thesis, but it laid groundwork that the Eastern correspondence researchers have built upon. The patterns are old. The recognition of the patterns is recent. What the deepening of the picture reveals is that no single tradition, taken alone, is sufficient. The Sumerian king list by itself can be read as literary convention. New Heliang complex by itself can be read as a local Hongshan development. Takenouchi manuscripts by themselves can be read as 20th century forgery. The Mohenjo-Daro Great Bath by itself can be read as a local ritual installation. The Hopi tradition by itself can be read as comparative folklore. Each of these dismissals is locally plausible. The Eastern correspondence thesis is the observation that the local dismissals, in aggregate, are not plausible. 5 independent traditions, 3 independent sites, 2 independent computational reconstructions, all converging on the same structural claim that there was a pre-flood network of significant sites, that those sites lay east of Mesopotamia, in the highland and mountain regions of Asia, and that the network was never fully abandoned, is a convergence that requires explanation. The conventional answer is that the convergence is coincidence. The Eastern correspondence answer is that the convergence is evidence. Neither answer has been proven. But the convergence is real. The most specific cross-cultural parallel to the Eastern correspondence thesis comes from a text that survived only at the geographical periphery of its own tradition. It is the Book of Enoch, also called First Enoch, Jewish text, composed in fragments over several centuries between approximately 300 BCE and the 1st century CE, preserved in continuous canonical use only by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, which still includes it in its scriptural canon. The Hebrew and Aramaic original survives in fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, but the only complete version is the Ethiopic Ge'ez translation, made from a now-lost Greek intermediary, preserved in the highland monasteries of Ethiopia for approximately 2,000 years. The Book of Enoch is relevant to the Eastern correspondence thesis in 2 specific ways. The first is its account of the descent of the Watchers, the angelic beings whom Enoch calls the sons of God. The Watchers descend from the heavens onto a specific mountain, Mount Hermon, what is now the border region between Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. And from there they teach humanity a series of specific technologies. The list of technologies is detailed and is worth reproducing in summary. The Watcher Azazel teaches metalworking, weapon manufacture, cosmetic arts. The Watcher Amezarak teaches enchantments. The Watcher Barakiel teaches astrology. The Watcher Kokabel teaches the constellations. The Watcher Shamziel teaches the signs of the sun. The Watcher Sariel teaches the courses of the moon. Each Watcher is named, each technology is named, and the location of the descent is named. This narrative pattern, divine or quasi-divine beings descend to a specific mountain, teach specific technologies to humanity, establish a permanent presence on that mountain, is the same pattern that the Sumerian tradition preserves in its accounts of the descent of the Anunnaki and the establishment of the cities of the antediluvian world. The Sumerian and the Enochic accounts are not literarily identical. They use different names, different mountain locations, and different specific technologies. But the structural shape is the same. Date range of the Enochic composition places it within the period in which Jewish scholarship had direct contact with the Babylonian astronomical and mythological tradition during the exile and afterward. The second way the Book of Enoch is relevant is its astronomical content, a substantial portion of the text. The section called the Astronomical Book, 1st Enoch, chapters 72 through 82, is a technical treatise on the courses of the sun and moon, the patterns of the stars, the structure of the year. The astronomy of 1st Enoch is not Babylonian in detail. It uses a 364-day schematic year rather than the Babylonian lunar solar calendar, but the underlying observation that astronomical knowledge was given to humanity by specific named beings who descended to specific named places identical to the Mesopotamian framework. The astronomical knowledge is divine in origin. It came from above. It is taught. Parallel deepens when we consider where the Book of Enoch was preserved. Ethiopia is in the Horn of Africa, geographically and culturally, at the periphery of the ancient Near Eastern world. Tewahedo Church preserved Enoch because it was part of their canon. The Jewish and Christian mainstream did not, and the book was effectively lost to Western scholarship for more than 1,000 years, until the Scottish traveller James Bruce brought 3 Ge'ez manuscripts back from Ethiopia in 1773. The text we now read was preserved at the edge of the world by a religious tradition that operated outside the institutional history of European Christianity, in a language that almost no Western scholar could read until the 19th century. The parallel to the Takenouchi manuscripts is direct, peripheral preservation, an institutional dismissal by the mainstream, a specific chronological and technological content that, when finally examined, fits structurally with the Mesopotamian source material. There is a third cross-cultural parallel that should be mentioned briefly here, because it widens the geographical scope of the pattern beyond Eurasia. The Popol Vuh, the Quiche Maya creation epic of highland Guatemala, preserved in oral tradition through the Spanish colonial period, and was transcribed in the Quiche language using Latin characters by an anonymous indigenous author in approximately the 1550s or 1560s. The Dominican friar Francisco Ximenez copied the manuscript at the beginning of the 18th century, and it survives today in the Newberry Library in Chicago. The Popol Vuh describes a series of creations and destructions of the human world, the actions of divine beings before and during these creations, and the eventual establishment of the Quiche polity in the highland Guatemalan landscape under the guidance of the founder rulers Balam Quitseb, Mahukuta, and Iki Balam. The structural parallel to the Sumerian antediluvian narrative is again present. Pre-human destructive cycles, divine beings active in those cycles, founder rulers who establish permanent sites of governance. The detail is different, the shape is the same. The conventional academic explanation for these structural correspondences across widely separated cultures is the deep psychological universality of certain narrative patterns. Mircea Eliade, the Romanian historian of religion, who taught at the University of Chicago from the 1950s onward, argued in The Myth of the Eternal Return, and in his other works that the cyclical destruction and renewal narrative is one of a small number universal mythic structures that emerge independently in every human culture. The conventional explanation is that the Hopi, the Maya, the Vedic Indians, the Sumerians, the Japanese, and the Enochic Jewish tradition each independently arrived at the same structural narrative, because structural narrative reflects something fundamental about the human encounter with time, death, and renewal. This is not an unreasonable explanation. It is the explanation that most mainstream comparative religion offers. The difficulty with the conventional explanation is that it accounts for the structural pattern, but not for the specific shared elements. The Hopi narrative includes specific Kachina figures who teach specific skills. The Enochic narrative includes specifically named watchers who teach specifically named technologies. The Sumerian narrative includes specifically named Anunnaki who establish specifically named cities. The Vedic narrative includes specifically named Saptarishi who establish specifically named sacred mountains. Popol Vuh includes specifically named founder rulers who establish specifically named sites. Across all 5 traditions, the pattern is not simply destruction and renewal. The pattern is divine beings, named, descending to specific places, teaching specific skills, establishing specific permanent sites. That is a much more specific pattern than mere cyclical mythology, and the explanation that all 5 cultures arrived at this much more specific pattern entirely independently is harder to sustain than the explanation that there is in some form a common underlying memory or tradition that all 5 are drawing on. Post. The Eastern correspondence researchers do not need to claim that the common memory is literally true in every detail. They need to claim only that it is common, that something happened, or was perceived to have happened, that left a memorable enough impression on widely separated cultures that they all preserved the same structural features of the event for thousands of years. What the something was is a separate question. That the something existed in some form is what the convergence suggests. Independent attestation across cultures is the standard that mainstream historiography uses to weigh ancient claims. When 5 independent traditions, drawn from regions that had no continuous documented contact at the time their traditions were formed, all preserve the same specific narrative pattern, the historian is supposed to treat that convergence as evidence of either a shared source or a shared underlying event. The Eastern correspondence thesis takes that standard at face value. It treats the convergence as evidence, does not insist on a particular interpretation of what the convergence means. It insists only that the convergence is real, and that it has not been explained away by appeal to universal psychological structures, because the specificity of the shared content is too high for that explanation to be sufficient. Strongest counter-argument to the Eastern correspondence thesis is also the most carefully constructed, and it deserves to be presented in its full force. The argument is most fully developed in the work of the comparative religionist Wendy Doniger, historian of ancient astronomy David Pingree, and, in a different register, the Assyriologist Jean Bottero. The argument runs roughly as follows. The structural similarities between widely separated ancient traditions are not, in the form presented by the Eastern correspondence researchers, evidence of a shared historical source. They are evidence of 2 well-documented diffusionist processes that operate continuously across the ancient world. The first is the long-distance transmission of mythic and astronomical material along trade routes. This transmission is documented in detail for the Hellenistic period and after, and there is no reason in principle why similar transmission could not have operated, at lower intensity, in earlier periods as well. The second is the convergent evolution of religious narrative under the influence of common environmental and psychological pressures. The pressures, agricultural risk, demographic catastrophe, and the universal human experience of generational succession. On this argument, structural similarities that the Eastern correspondence researchers point to are real but explicable. The Sumerian Enochic correspondence is the product of direct contact during the Babylonian exile and the Hellenistic period. The Sumerian Vedic correspondence is the product of long-distance trade contact across the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. Sumerian New Heliang correspondence, if it exists at all, is the product of the deep psychological universality of platform-mound architecture as religious form, a form that emerges independently wherever a culture combines agricultural surplus, social stratification, and the desire to elevate ritual space above the surrounding terrain. The Sumerian Takenouchi correspondence is the product of an early 20th century Japanese forger who had access to the Sumerian material through European Orientalist publications that were available in Tokyo. By the early 1900s, the Sumerian Hopi correspondence is the product of independent convergent evolution under the universal pressures of cyclical mythology. This counter-argument is serious. It is the standard mainstream position, and it is held by responsible scholars who are not motivated by hostility to alternative historical hypotheses, but by their assessment that the diffusionist and convergent evolution explanations are sufficient to account for the observed evidence without requiring an additional shared source. It is also, the Eastern correspondence researchers respond, the position that has not been argued in detail for any of the specific correspondences that the Eastern correspondence thesis rests on. The diffusionist explanation for the Sumerian Enochic correspondence is plausible, but has not been worked out specifically for the Watcher Anunnaki parallel, the Watcher list of named technologies, and the Sumerian list of Mes, the divine functions that the goddess Inanna brings from Eridu to Uruk in the relevant Sumerian narrative, share specific items in specific orders that diffusion does not on its own account for. The convergent evolution explanation for platform-mound architecture is plausible, but does not account for the specific cardinal direction orientation and the specific astronomical alignments shared between New Heliang and Eridu. Forgery explanation for the Takenouchi manuscripts is plausible, but has not been worked out in detail, showing which Western Orientalist publications the supposed forger consulted, and how the specific chronological structure was derived. The element that the counter-argument fails to account for is the convergence itself, considered as a whole. Each individual diffusionist or convergent evolution explanation is locally adequate. The combined picture, 5 traditions, 3 sites, Polternield, multiple specific architectural and chronological correspondences, requires multiple independent explanations to be simultaneously true. Each of those explanations is undefended in detail for its specific case. The counter-argument, in other words, is a list of in-principle alternative explanations rather than a worked-out alternative account. The current state of the debate is that the mainstream position is held by appeal to default explanatory frameworks that have not been applied in detail to the Eastern correspondence material, and the alternative position is held by researchers who have worked out specific correspondences but do not have the institutional resources to publish in the venues where the mainstream would have to engage. The question remains genuinely unresolved. It is not a question that has been answered. It is a question that has been deferred, and the deferral has now lasted for the better part of a century. Since Sitchin began publishing, the Eastern correspondence thesis is substantially correct. The revisions required to the conventional account of early human civilization would be specific and limited. The conventional chronology of East Asian state formation would need to push back by approximately 1,000 years to accommodate the organized polity that built New Helang. The conventional treatment of the Sumerian king list would need to admit the possibility that the antediluvian section preserves geographically anchored memory rather than pure literary convention. The conventional treatment of the Takenouchi manuscripts would need to shift from blanket forgery accusation to a more careful question about underlying source material. The conventional understanding of the Indus Valley's religious architecture would need to make room for transmitted influence from Mesopotamia rather than purely indigenous development. These are not earth-shattering revisions. They are the kind of adjustments that occur regularly in archaeological consensus when new evidence forces a reweighting. The implication for other unresolved questions in the field is broader. If the Eastern correspondence pattern is real, then similar patterns may be worth looking for in other parts of the world. The South American highland sites of Tiwanaku and Corral, the North African pre-dynastic Egyptian sites, the Saharan rock art tradition, the early Anatolian sites at Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe. Each of these has been the subject of fringe-adjacent speculation. None of them has been subjected to the kind of cross-cultural reading that the Eastern correspondence researchers have attempted for the Mesopotamian Asian zone. The methodological lesson. Read the texts as if they might mean what they say. Run the calculations through modern computational tools. Place the results next to the excavation records. Is portable. What remains is the simple fact that the artifacts are real, the sources are published, and the question is open. The Sumerian king list names the cities. The New Heliang mounds are still there. Hokuriku mountains are still venerated. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro is still where it has always been. The question is still open. The well-Blundell prism is in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. The Bond and Hempsel reconstruction is published. New Heliang complex is in Liaoning province, and the platform mounds are still oriented to the cardinal directions. Kuriku mountains rise above the central Japanese coast, and the shrines on them have been venerated for at least 1,400 years of documented practice. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro is still in the Pakistani earth, where John Marshall found it in the 1920s. Book of Enoch is in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon. The Popol Vuh is in the Newberry Library in Chicago. The texts are real. The sites are real. The named researchers are real and their credentials are findable. What the antediluvian kings ruled, and where they ruled it, what kind of beings they were, and whether their seats in the eastern mountains were ever abandoned, is still open. It has been open since Stephen Langdon published his translation in 1923. It is still open now,